Yep, it's on now. We're good. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to the first CocoaHeads back for 2025. It's good to have you here. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'll just do a few minutes of housekeeping and then we'll get into the first talk. So, hello. Myself and Christian are your hosts tonight. Any issues or concerns, come and speak to one of us. And as always, a reminder that we have a code of conduct, which you can read in full on the website, but the key ideas there to be respectful, be inclusive, and be aware. Again, any issues related to the code of conduct, feel free to let Christian or myself know. We don't have a sign-in today. A massive thank you to Billu, our sponsor tonight, for hosting us, obviously, and helping with our costs like food and drink and meetup hosting and things like that. A reminder, we have a Slack community, so if you're not in the Slack yet, feel free to take a photo of that and join when it suits. But it's a good place to hang out throughout the month, talk about Apple-related iOS development things, and there's also a Sydney channel in there that I post when there's a new meetup announced and things like that. We are on YouTube tonight, so just the camera's at the back there, but shout out to
you
YouTube.
say the subline thing in that voice that everybody always does?
I don't even know where to start.
He left off the bit about the bell.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, smash that like button. It's all about the algorithm. Yeah. Anyone attending for the first time tonight? Welcome. Good to have you here. And if you like what you hear here tonight, Melbourne CocoaHeads do a similar thing. They run on the second Thursday of the month. We're on the third. Definitely recommend checking out that group if you're ever in Melbourne, or their excellent live streams as well. You can watch from home and they're usually very high quality. They do a good stream.
At the same caliber as this.
Yes, of course. Sorry, I wasn't dissing. They do a good job. I don't know. All right. DevWorld conference has kind of been announced. We have rough dates, it looks like. So if anyone's attended DevWorld before, it's the iOS conference that runs in Melbourne most years. Looking like it will be early September. I'm not sure if it's going to run for that whole period, the 2nd to the 5th, or if they're just like the blocked out dates, but I guess there'll be more updates in the months to come. Is anyone hiring or looking for work? Now's a chance to say a few words. Yeah, do you want to stand up and introduce yourself and say what you're looking for? Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Good idea for the YouTube.
My name is Fire. I'm newcomer here, and about 1 month in Sydney, and I'm studying Macro Center, and I'm looking for a part-time, maybe casual, maybe job. By the way, I have 13 years of experience, and I can work on B2C, B2B, any kind of job.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Because I make the slides, I get to put up one when I know of someone who's hiring. Very simply, if you are a contractor with some capacity, not much capacity, generally like 1 or 2 days a month, it's the kind of thing you can do after hours, and you have any kind of experience with video stuff, preferably streaming. It's yeah, complicated stuff, but good fun and a great company to work for. If you have any interest in that, come and speak to me, and I can give you more details and things like that, and see if you'd be a good fit. Yeah, I'll be around in the break, of course. But yeah, preferably contractor and that kind of thing, like set up already. So yeah. And we have a few words from TC about International Women's Day. I'll give you the mic.
Oh, I need to speak into that?
Yeah, just for YouTube.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm not sure everybody here knows me, but my name is TC. I work at Apple in developer relations. Despite the rumors, I'm not here to speak with you about the iPhone 16e. In fact, I'm here to speak with you about the International Women's Week or Day. I'm not sure if you're aware, but we celebrate International Women's Day at Apple, and we did last year in the Sydney event. We're doing it again this year, and I'd like all of you to think about joining us for that. So it's a celebration of women's accomplishments, and can I share with you that according to the World Economic Forum, at the rate that we're going right now, women and men will reach equality at about 2158, which is a problem. So the theme for this year is called Accelerate Action, and is to get ourselves in gear and do something about it, right? So the event is free to attend. Everyone's invited at Apple in Sydney, but you do have to register online. And the way you do that is to go to developer.apple.com. You will see a link with Serenity's picture that says hello developer. Just click through there and you will find a way of registering. Like I said, it's free to attend. Please tell your fellow developers as well. The only requirement is that it is for members of our developer program. I think that's pretty much all I need to cover. Oh, of course, we have various speakers across the day. It starts from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. roughly, and 3 of them are developers you probably would have heard from within Australia. So come around and support them on the 11th of March, which is a Tuesday. Okay, thank you. Cheers, sir.
All right, awesome. Thanks, JC. Okay, so looking ahead to next month, our next meetup is scheduled for the 20th of March. As usual, I'll post full details on Meetup on our Meetup page as we get closer. And we still have capacity for speakers. I think we have 1 speaker at the moment, so there's 1 or 2 more slots. And if you're interested in speaking, either talk to Christian or myself tonight, or send us a message throughout the month on Slack, and we can make that happen. Just a reminder, please make sure you update your RSVPs on Meetup. It really helps us know who's going to come ahead of time. All right, onto the schedule for tonight. So our first talk, it's going to be from Adam, and we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back, and I'll be talking after that, and then we'll have some time to hang around and socialize as well if you want to stick around. So without further ado, over to Adam. Thank you.
We're good now? All right. Yeah, I'm Adam. I'm the creative director at StripeySock. We're a Canberra-based mobile development agency, so that's probably why you haven't seen me here before. I'm usually at the Canberra CocoaHeads. But the Canberra CocoaHeads is essentially 6 of us sitting at a pub, discussing what work we've done in the last month. So I was actually pretty excited about this work that we've done. So I thought I approached Zach to ask whether I could talk to you guys about it. It's also extremely esoteric, so apologies if it doesn't entertain any of you. So as I said, I'm the creative director of StripeySock, and StripeySock is a bunch of things, but it's also the digital partner of the National Portrait Gallery. And so this means that we develop the public-facing apps for the gallery, but we also work closely with them to develop digital experiences for school and corporate groups. So what we've got here, this is sort of one example of one of the experiences. And this, like most of them, use AR kind of lightly. I mean, we're really just using it for image recognition, which is great. And it served the purpose. And I mean, prior to that, we were using some weird proprietary stuff to do artwork recognition, and it was slow and heavy. And when image anchors came to AR, it just made things a whole lot easier, and it didn't have those dependencies. But that was sort of the extent of AR up until this point. And then along came the Vision Pro. And when that was announced, we, like everybody else, was sort of going, wow, how can we get our hands on this? How can we, leverage this new platform? And so we were able to pull a proof of concept together pretty quickly for the gallery. And this was an app where you could view the gallery's artwork full size in your own home. And, it could distract you from the laundry that you had to do in the background there. And it was pretty cool. And we got to spend time with TC and in the Apple labs prior to the Australian launch of the Vision Pro. And we even got to bring the director of the Portrait Gallery up to get her to, try this out on device. And whilst the Vision Pro wasn't suitable for institutional use, it's not the sort of device that we can hand out to 20 kids and go, hey, go through the gallery. The director was just blown away by the possibilities of AR, and she wanted to use it somehow in future. And so that's kind of where it sat for about a month. And then when it was announced that they were going to run the major exhibition for the summit, in this case it was Joan Ross as the artist, the director said, we need to get an AR experience in as part of that. So we were tasked with building that. So that's what I'm going to talk through tonight, about the development of that. I should emphasize that this isn't a masterclass on Reality Kit. We're, as I mentioned, we were fairly new to this, but I'll try to share some of my learnings along the way, and maybe you'll find it useful. So the first thing we knew about Joan Ross was that she used recurring motifs in her artwork. So at a high level, we knew that the experience would involve interacting with these items somehow. And a lot of her commentary is around colonialism. So we thought a monarch butterfly, which besides being a monarch is also an invasive species, seemed like a good place to start. So, before we bedded down what the experience might be, we just wanted to see what was technically possible. So as I mentioned, we had experience with working with image detection through image anchors. So we thought, right, let's just try and get a model placed onto an image. And yeah, that worked. That was cool. This sort of all took place not long after DubDub 24. And amongst the announcements there was that it brought Reality View, which was previously only for Vision OS, brought that into iOS. And when SwiftUI was announced, I jumped into it completely, and I've never wanted to go back to UIKit ever since. So every chance that I get to use a SwiftUI component, I will try to use that. So, Reality View was really exciting for me. And timeline animations was the other cool thing. And so seeing those as the way forward, I just went, right, it's worth investing in the future, investigating that rather than going back and learning the old way of doing things. What could go wrong? So this was the code that goes along, a snippet of code that goes along with the very cool botanist session, which was in that talked about 3D content in Reality Composer Pro, and it explains how we use notifications to pass code between, to pass information between code and Reality Composer Pro. It's pretty simple. We give our notification a name in Reality Composer Pro, then we just listen for those notifications with that name in code. Except that's not how it actually works. Somewhere around about, I think, Xcode 16 beta 3, that changed. So a Reality Composer Pro notification is sent with a consistent name, and then we're required to inspect the user info content there to see what event that relates to. So a good lesson here is that you shouldn't take what you see in DubDub videos as gospel. Yeah, we got there in the end, but it was a little bit of head scratching and going, hey, why doesn't this work? So anyway, with that sorted, we're able to get timeline animations hooked up. So when we tapped on the virtual butterfly, it takes off. I'll wait until the video catches up. So we tap on it, it starts to fly away, it turns, and then it flies over to the next artwork. As cool as that was to be able to do that, it was actually a bit of a dead end. With timelines, we could say, go to this position or move that far and that way. But what our idea with going from one portrait to another was that would be a little bit dynamic. So we'd be loading that in from a CMS, and we wouldn't know where in space that portrait was until it was detected on a wall over here. So it wasn't feasible to pass that information, that location information, back into timelines. The other thing that was a problem with timelines is because you're using these notifications to go back between the two, if we were to clone an entity from Reality Composer Pro, which saves a lot of disk reading, it would mean that whenever we sent the notification back, it would send the notification to all instances of an entity. So if we had, say, 10 butterflies there and said butterfly was tapped, all 10 would float off all at once. And look, there were probably some sort of way that we could work around that, but we were working with time constraints. So we ditched the timeline animations and went back to procedural ones. That did mean that we could have control over our individual entities. So we could here we had them just hovering in space, and they would just hover there after they're being tapped until we moved on to the next portrait. And then those things would sort of follow us around. So they could be, you could be tapping them and they could follow you around the room. You will notice that reality's knowledge of 3D space is extraordinary. It's amazing, but it's not perfect. So you'll see here as they land, they'll just sort of skip. And that's because what we were finding was when they were coming over to the portrait, there was a centimetre or so where it was off, and like over a couple of meters, that's pretty cool, but it sort of broke the illusion when they were sort of hovering above the artwork. Anyway, we had, at that point, we sort of had an understanding of how the tech was working. But that experience was actually pretty boring. It wasn't going to be engaging. So we sat down and we worked with the curatorial and education teams to sort of define our audience and sort of consider the experience from their point of view. Our first idea was a treasure hunt, which kind of seems obvious. We could go into these artworks and go, "Oh, there's the bee, there's the butterfly, there's the flower." Seemed like a great idea. Unfortunately, much of the artist's work is a scathing commentary on colonialists' needs to collect, catalogue, and name everything. So, that idea was out. And at the same time, there was this idea that we'd probably have like a family themed space that wasn't part of the exhibition itself. It might be a room off to the side where people could take their young families as a time out, and still themed to match the artworks, but it meant that it wasn't essential that there had to be a direct interaction with the artworks. So we decided that we should just let everyone be like the artist. They'd be able to create their own little collages themselves using the same motifs in Joan's work. They could even resize, rotate, and tint the entities to suit their creation. So you might see here we've got UI controls for resizing the objects and for rotating them, but that's actually really easy to implement in Reality Kit. You kind of get all of that for free if you want, but it would mean that we wouldn't get the ability to use the tap gestures to dismiss a butterfly, or we've got a swipe gesture where we could potentially get rid of all of the items at once. We also, the target audience was families with young kids, preschool, primary school age. So we didn't want to rely on assumed knowledge about gestures or even fine motor skills. So, that was a factor as well. So with that, kind of went, yeah, cool. This is going to meet the needs. It's kind of a fun little thing. But we still, considering the audience, we kind of thought having mum and dad and a few kids around a single device wasn't the best experience. But at the same time, we didn't want to give every member of the family their own device and let them go off and not, just be on a device by themselves. We wanted it to be a collaborative experience. So we thought, hey, what if they could use individual devices to create a shared artwork? And so that's where the second half comes in, multi-peer connectivity. Thankfully, Reality Kit leverages multi-peer connectivity and the multi-peer connectivity framework to automatically keep the scenes of connected devices synchronized. So when you enable it, what you see in one scene automatically syncs over to the other. And it's actually really kind of easy to do. I mean, ignoring the fact that I've got to create our own multi-peer session there, but it's basically just adding, is collaboration enabled, turning that to true for your AR config, and selecting a sync service for your scene. The only problem with this is we were using SwiftUI Reality View, and so I couldn't do that. So anyway, out with Reality View, we're back to UI representable. And anyway, back with AR Kit, Reality Kit, AR View. We hooked it up and it worked sometimes. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. Mostly it didn't. Sometimes entities would show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes the animations would work, sometimes they wouldn't. turns out that every change to the scene reality kit syncs all of the entities. So this model here, this B model, is about 30 meg. When we've got a bunch of those, it's syncing those, and if everyone's a different color, it's not so much a clone. So we're very quickly moving a lot of data and sort of expecting that data to be moved instantly. So what we can do is turn off synchronization on particular entities. And that's what we did. We still had our animal entities, but when they were added to a scene by tapping, we would create a shadow entity that contained the metadata, the type of animal it was, the color, the rotation, that sort of thing. And that shadow entity would be synced instead. And then we'd leave it up to the individual device to then draw the animal locally. And when the animal was tapped, again, the shadow entity was removed from the scene, and that triggered the removal and associated animations on all the other devices. And all of a sudden, that was actually working really well. So you can see as one person's adding the cyan colored bee, other one's doing the orange butterfly, and we're getting the animation on both devices pretty much instantaneously. So that's what we ended up delivering, and we did find, however, that multi-peer isn't always that reliable. We often still found issues creating that connection in the first place. There is also a limit that you can only have a maximum of 8 peers doing multi-peer connectivity at any time. So that would need to be taken into consideration as well. So in the end, time constraints meant that we weren't able to debug those connection issues and design a more robust connection. Like it would have been really good to have just a little bit of an interface to say, I'm with this family, so it's only going to be these 4 devices that are part of this session. Didn't have time to do that, so we ended up just turning off the feature by default, just having a settings for it. But it really didn't matter in the end. Once we got it out to the hands of the users for watching the kids use it, and we just got fantastic feedback from families. There were times where they would just spend half an hour just playing around, creating images, then going back and doing it again. They would go out to the gallery, then the kids would want to go and do it one more time. So it achieved its purpose. So it was a really big hit for, particularly for small families. So, still, even though the multi-peer connectivity wasn't included, it's still there in our code. So we're really hoping that we'll get a chance to use it again. And yeah, that's our experience. So look, my main takeaways are WWDC stuff is really shiny and awesome. And we're really lucky because these are on gallery devices. They bought 20, 30 M4 iPads as soon as they're available for this project, and subsequent projects. So we had those devices. They were able to put the latest OS on there. We didn't have to support backwards compatibility, but even so, some of those things, even if it's just because there's a lot more documentation on an old way of doing things, sometimes it's better just to err on that side until you're comfortable. So yeah, there we go. So
Thanks, Adam. Are you happy to take some questions?
yeah, I was going to say, is anybody?
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
Not a question, but I just want to say this is one of the probably the coolest thing I've seen with with Apple
if you
AR.
want to try it.
Thank you.
Okay, so thinking a bit to the future,
Yeah.
what changes to Reality Kit would you like to see to make these kinds of experiences better?
Look, as I said, I'm heavily in the SwiftUI camp, so I do. There was some sort of footnote in the Reality View documentation that you can load a custom AR config, which may have been a path I could have gone down to bring that in. So whether, seeing a change in future to make these more obscure features easy to implement in Reality View, that'd be great. But I think just as these things progress and Stack Overflow fills up with more answers to questions, it's going to be a little bit easier to jump in and find out more about them. As for the frameworks themselves, it's the framework has more there than I'm pushing. So yeah, ask me again in 12 months maybe.
Any more? All right, I'm sure Adam will be around in the break if you want to try that out.
Yeah.
Thanks again. Another round of applause. Adam. Great. We will take a very quick break. I know I always say that, but I'm going to try and hold it to 5 minutes. There's a few pieces of pizza left. If you need to use the toilets, go out in the corridor, turn left, and they're at the end past the elevators. Otherwise, we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Thanks. Great to be able to go into the store and see everyone using it. All right, well, that was easy. Everyone's just. Are we live, Christian? All right, cool. Let's get started. So no, it's the last talk. I plan to talk for about 35-40 minutes, but if you need to go, no hard feelings. It's fine. Not signaling out anyone in particular. Just it's all good. Not signaling out Tom. Definitely not. All right. So live activities. So over the years, our phones have gotten better and better at being able to keep us up to date with important information. But there's times when you want this information, and there's times when you don't. So let's say you want to keep up to date with the scores in a footy match. Until recently, the best way to do this would have been push notifications and sending a new one every time there's an important update. And this works, but they can kind of interrupt your flow, or they can just be annoying. And we kind of fixed this problem by being able to assign priority to notifications, and then you as the user can opt in to only be disturbed by the time-sensitive ones. And that gets us part of the way there, but it doesn't fix the whole problem. Then a few years ago, I think it was 2020, widgets came along, and these get us most of the way there. But they have a problem, and that is they're shown all the time, even when they don't have any relevant information to show. And so there's got to be a better way, right? That's where the topic of this talk comes into it, and that's live activities. What is a live activity? Well, it's a feature of iOS introduced, iOS 16.1, and they're introduced seemingly as a way to make use of the space around the dynamic island, which is the hardware sensor at the top of your phone, the kind of black bar that you might see there. And they do this in a pretty playful and creative way. They're nice and fun, but they're also very useful. And so the UI is designed to offer like glanceable information, but importantly, it's information that is currently and contextually relevant to the user. So you can kind of think of them like widgets, but for something that's more important in the moment. And importantly, unlike widgets, they go away when they're not needed. And so they don't really clutter your device. And the first time someone will see a live activity is probably on their lock screen. And then they'll unlock the device, and assuming they have a device with a dynamic island, they will see the live activity on either side of the dynamic island. There might be a couple of live activities running at the same time, in which case your app only gets one side of the island. And then on more modern phones and even Apple Watches with always-on displays, your live activities are visible pretty much all the time. Even when the screen is off, you can still kind of glance at the information on the locked phone. And starting in watchOS 11, they show on your Apple Watch, and they just, by default, take these couple of views from your iOS live activity and show them on the watch. But you as the developer can even customize this and create something better on the Apple Watch. And so since seeing live activities initially, I've been quite fascinated and have really enjoyed using them. And there's some really good examples out there. I'll quickly highlight 4. So Uber have a really good live activity. And the thing, I don't even catch that many Ubers. I probably catch like 2 Ubers a year. And every time I do, I love the live activity. Can't stop looking at it. But what I like most about it is that it adjusts contextually depending on where you are in the ride. So if you're waiting for a pickup, it will show you information about the car you're looking for. And then when you're in the car, it'll show you, time to destination and other things that are relevant there. And Flighty, which is an app for flight tracking, is also really good at this, where, in the time you'd head to the airport, it's telling you information about delays and whatever. And then maybe when you get to the airport, it's telling you about your gate, and when you're boarding, about your seat. Like it does a really good job of transitioning through this important information. There's also some really good apps for keeping up with live sports. So there's ScoreCheck if you follow the AFL. This is a pretty good app. And then we've just come out of cricket season, so I've been using CrickBuzz a lot for keeping up with cricket scores. Yeah, equally good. And so why are live activities good for sport? Well, matches are time limited. They usually only go for a couple of hours, maybe half a day. And they also have a lot of regular updates. And you probably don't want a notification every time someone scores, but the score is always ticking over, or the clock is always ticking up. And so there's always something happening and something changing. If you're a sport fan, following live is very important. And you want that to be as easy as possible. You don't want to have to unlock your phone, find an app, navigate 3 screens deep, and get the score. It's pretty handy to just be able to glance at the lock screen on your phone. And chances are, if you're checking the score on your phone, you're doing something else. You're not watching the game. And so you want to be able to access it very, very easily. And so, well, what is this talk? It's an introduction to live activities. We've just been over that. We're going to talk a little bit about the UI that you have to provide as a developer, and then talking about designing for all of these UI states. And then we'll talk about kind of the life cycle of a live activity. So starting, updating, and ending a live activity. And there's a couple of ways to do this. And then I'll leave you with some tips and tricks, as well as a couple of resources that I found pretty helpful while developing live activities. And so the idea is that by the end of this talk, you'll have an appreciation for live activities and maybe even start thinking about possible use cases in the apps you work on. But what, what qualifies me to talk about live activities? The truth is absolutely nothing. I haven't even shipped an app with live activities yet. However, I have built a couple. And so everything I say in this talk is based on my experience in development that hasn't been battle tested in production. So keep that in mind. All right, let's talk a little bit about the UI. And I'm going to use this sports score app as an example the whole way throughout, because like I said, it's a really good example. So live activities show up in a few places around the system. The first is on the lock screen. But the way that it works is you have to provide UI for all of these states, and then it's up to the system to render it based on where the user is, whether they're on the lock screen, whether they're looking at it in the dynamic island or whatever. And the way that it works on the lock screen is you're given essentially just a Swift UI view to display. You can see there you get almost the full width of the screen, and you have a height limit of 160 points, which I found you can fit about 5 lines of text in, but really it's pretty squishy. I think 3, maybe 4 works best if the text is really small. But yeah, eventually, like beyond that limit, you will be clipped. So just keep that in mind. And that's 160 points at the standard like font size. I'm not sure, it might scale up a bit beyond that. Now, then you unlock the phone and you might see the dynamic island in one of a couple of states. The first is, sorry, you might see the live activity in one of a couple of states. The first is on the status bar, this compact presentation. You see it taking up either side of the dynamic island, and you get kind of 2 Swift UI views that you can display there. And then there's also this expanded presentation mode, and this allows you to put a little bit more information than you can fit in the island, and you get into this state one of 2 ways. And the first is by the user long pressing on the dynamic island. It kind of expands out. It's pretty cool. And then the other way is when the developer decides that an update is important enough to get the user's attention. And so it kind of expands down from the island, almost like a notification, with the idea being to draw your attention to whatever the important update was. Now you also have to design for this minimal mode. And this is where your live activity is shown on either side of the dynamic island. You don't control which side it's shown on. It'll just depend on, I don't know, system factors. And yeah, you can either be on the left or the right side, leading or the trailing side, but you don't get a say in that. And this is a different Swift UI view to what we saw on the previous screen. So it doesn't reuse either of those ones. It's separate, and it's probably the hardest state to design for because you basically have no space. So it can be pretty difficult to know what's put there. Now, live activities are also shown in standby mode, which is when your phone is on its side and horizontal and plugged into charge. You don't actually have to provide separate UI for this. What happens is the system will take your lock screen UI, scale it up, and then expand the background if there is one. And then it's also worth noting that it's possible to add buttons or interactions to live activities. And it works a lot like the widget system where these buttons run an app intent and perform some action. But interactive live activities are beyond the scope of this talk, so I'm not going to talk about them, but they do exist. Okay, that was the UI. Now we'll get into the technical stuff. I'm just going to have some water. Should have put another GIF on that slide. Okay, so in this technical section, we'll talk about adding them to your app. There's not much to do there. Handling all of the possible UI states from a code perspective, starting, updating, and ending live activities. And there's a couple of ways to do this. So you can do this locally and remotely, and we'll go over examples for both. Now, there will be a bit of code on these slides, and it's not important to understand it all. What I will do is put a box around the most important part, and I usually just copy a bit of the code from the previous slide to the next slide just so that there's context as we're moving through it. It's a little bit difficult to do this kind of talk without a bit of code. So we get started by adding a new extension target to our Xcode project. You've probably all done this before for various reasons. I'm assuming we're starting with a blank, like a fresh Xcode project here, and we don't already have a widget extension. If you do have a widget extension, then you don't actually need to do this step because live activities piggyback off the widget system. But yeah, if you're starting from scratch, it's probably worth ticking that box for include a live activity because then you get some of the templates and stuff that you will eventually need. And so one of the first things you'll see after accepting that template is you get a struct conforming to activity attributes. I've changed the name, but everything else is just the default code that Xcode will generate for you. But let's swap it out with a data model that we can use for our live scores app. Now, there's two types of data that you can provide a live activity with. And so that's why we've kind of broken things up into two parts here. And this is actually enforced by the widget system, but anything that's a property on your activity attribute struct is something that is set when you start a live activity, and then it's unchanging for the duration of the live activity. So in the case of our app, things like the teams that are playing, they're not going to change, the venue, start time, all those kinds of things. But then we have this nested content state struct. And this is where we put the data that will change throughout the duration of the live activity. And so in the case of a footy game, again, scores, obviously they're going to change regularly, the elapsed time, the state, things like that. And you'll see why those distinctions are important in a bit. And now this is also part of what the template will generate. So it will generate you a widget bundle, which is your entry point for any widgets you might have. And we need to add our live activity to this. So if you already have widgets in place or in your target, you just need to add to this the body of this struct. But if you don't, you'll get something generated that looks like this. And then finally, there's this live activity. What is that? It's just a type that conforms to widget. And if you've worked with the widget system, it would look quite familiar to you. But where it starts to differ from kind of traditional home screen and lock screen widgets is that our widget configuration is actually an activity configuration. And this is for our live activity. And it's here where kind of all the magic happens for our UI. We start by, we have two closures that we need to return essentially Swift UI views from, and we get past our context. And our context in this case is our state, so our activity attributes, and then also our content state. And then they can be passed through to our views and rendered however we want. So an example here is that this top closure, we need to return the lock screen UI. And again, this can be more or less any Swift UI view with obviously some limitations for static content, like you can't load an async image, for example. It all needs to be baked into the binary or downloaded ahead of time. But yeah, we can return a view here, and that's our lock screen sorted. Like obviously a real app is going to be more complicated than this, but that's all we need to do to start getting that UI shown on the lock screen. It's pretty cool. And then we have this second closure, which is where we return all of the view states for the different combinations of views that I mentioned before, where you can be in the dynamic island with a few different states. So it's a bit longer. I'll put it on a separate slide and then kind of trim that down so you can see it. So this is what that dynamic island kind of view builder type thing looks like. And it's broken down into a few things, but you can see here that we can access that context again, and that contains our state, so we can render some information about the match. These last three closures are the states for the dynamic island when it's kind of in that collapsed mode, if you will, where it's just taking up a little bit of space. So compact leading and compact trailing are what's shown left and right on the island, and they're always shown together. So if one of them's shown, you can assume the other will be shown, so that information can kind of be linked, whereas minimal is always shown by itself, and that's that really small state. Here, probably the most interesting part is this first closure-y thing, which is where we define our views for the dynamic island when it's in that expanded mode. And interestingly, this can be composed with a bunch of views. And you don't have to provide a view for all regions, but you can see here our code's defining a view for the leading, trailing, and bottom views. And if you don't provide a view, say, for example, you don't provide the bottom, it just kind of collapses up and takes up less space. It's quite flexible in that way. You can also take the lazy option. You might not need to define all of those regions, and you can just define, say, a bottom region, and then you essentially get the rectangle with rounded rects, but you get that space to define kind of whatever you want. And again, these are just Swift UI views, so there's nothing fancy going on here. The only limitation when you're showing something in a dynamic island is that it has a black background and there's no concept of light and dark mode. It's just always essentially in that dark mode. So you want white or light text anyway. Okay, so that was the crash course on designing for live activities. But now let's get into some of the technical stuff and talk about controlling a live activities. So I've danced around this point a little bit, but there's a couple of ways to control live activities. The first is from your app while it's running. You have more or less full control. And you can also control and update live activities remotely from a server. And so we'll talk about like the whole life cycle here, starting, updating, and ending for each of these two options. Oh, I did have slides for that. Okay. So to start a live activity from the app, it's actually pretty simple. And this is more or less all the code you need. The first step is to construct both of those data models that we saw before. So we need to initialize our attributes. These are the unchanging things about the live activity. And then the initial content state, whatever the state is that we're going to first render our live activity in. And then once those are created, we simply call this request method on the type of live activity. You can obviously have multiple types of live activities. So here it's generic to the live match attributes, which is the one we defined before. And then the system will try and create it based on a bunch of factors. But if it succeeds, that's it. That's all we need to do. It appears on the lock screen. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But it is worth noting that this can fail for a few reasons. And so you want to catch this error and probably show a message to the user if they tried to do this and the live activity can't be shown. It's also worth holding on to the live activity, just like in memory, so that you can then like perform actions on it later on. And then there's also a few observers that we can set up for essentially life cycle things to do with the live activity. I'm not really going to talk about these in too much detail, other than the last one, which I'll touch on a little bit later, but it's just good to know that they exist. And if you forget to hold on to anything, it's fine. You can always access the current sort of set of live activities that might be visible just by accessing the activities attribute, and you just get an array returned. Yeah, so our live activity has begun. It's shown on our lock screen. You can see that the match is about to start. It's pretty cool. And then look, if you've got your head around the code from a few slides ago, updating the data on our live activity is pretty similar to starting it. So we create our updated content state with our latest match information in this case. And then good thing we've held a reference to that activity because all we need to do is call update on it. And then from here, the system handles the rest for you. Like there's nothing fancy you need to do. It will go and regenerate each of those views a little bit like widgets if you're familiar, and then just show them around the place when the user's browsing on their phone and it's applicable to show it. Probably recognizing a theme here, but ending a live activity is very much the same. We create that final content state, and it's important to note that it is final. So once we end a live activity, whatever state we've given it is final. And then we call the end method, and it's pretty straightforward. Here we do also need to set a dismissal policy, or actually we can just opt into the default, and that is after 4 hours, the live activity will be removed from the lock screen, 4 hours after it's ended, that is. But there are a couple of other options we can choose. So you can choose to have it dismissed immediately. So, you know, whatever event you're following might have ended and you want to get rid of it, or you can set a custom date in the future if you want that isn't that 4-hour limit. And then our live activity is in its final state and it's hanging around for 4 hours. Okay, so that's the start to end life cycle of a live activity. But it's worth keeping in mind that for all of this to happen, your app has to either be in the foreground, so the user has to be using it or at least opening it, or the app has to have some background time. So things like background app refresh. And if you've ever worked with background app refresh, you know that you can't reliably guarantee you're going to get updates. And so in the case of an app like we're working on for live sports scores, you don't want the user to have to open the app repeatedly to be able to run that code and update it, because that's kind of against the point of having it on your lock screen, right, and updating quickly. And so while this method might be fine for a lot of use cases, in our case, it's not going to work. So let's talk about the other way to control live activities. And this way is a lot more reliable, especially when your app is in the background. And that's doing it from a server or doing it remotely. And so I mentioned that live activities are kind of like widgets, but that is really only true from the UI perspective. The way that like a widget will update to a scheduled timeline, there's no guarantees and things like that. You know, if the device is in low power mode, you might not get your update. But live activities, you can actually update them pretty reliably and pretty regularly, at least every few seconds without issue. And so this is all managed by a different system to, say, WidgetKit. And it's a system that's designed to deliver like fast, real-time information to iOS devices, and it's been around since the early days. And that is the push notification system. So if you've already got infrastructure in place for your application to send push notifications to customers, you're half or probably most of the way there to being able to support live activities that are updated remotely. So it's pretty cool. For those who don't know, the way that push notifications work is essentially your server sends a message to Apple servers, or it's called APNS, Apple's push notification service. And this request contains metadata that will then be processed by Apple servers and passed on to the device, and that ends with a notification lighting up the screen, essentially, a title and a message. And in our case, we're going to be sending a very similar payload to Apple servers, but it contains metadata about our live activity. So instead of alerting the user like a traditional notification would, it's just going to update the content in our live activity. So how does it differ from a payload you might be familiar with for push notifications? Well, when we're sending an update to a live activity, we need to append this push type live activity to the APNS topic header. And we also need to set the push type to live activity. You can also set the priority, which tells the system how important the update is. Low priority updates should be 5 and high priority should be 10. If you do have a whole bunch of updates, it's probably worth sending a bunch of 5s and then only sending the really important ones as a 10, just so you don't get throttled. And then the user's push token forms part of the URL. So that's how we identify the specific device or the specific user we're sending the token to. And it's either a token for starting a live activity or a token for updating a live activity. And we'll be talking about how to get both of them in just a minute. And then the last thing to note on the payload is that the body of this request contains our content state, which matches perfectly with the content state that we defined in our app for our data model for updates. It's worth noting that the payload for a live activity can't exceed 4 kilobytes in size. And so you'll probably struggle if you're just sending the exact same content that you would fetch from your iOS app, like at launch or whatever. And you probably want to trim that down and send some custom data that only contains information for the live activity. Okay, so how do we actually start a live activity from the server? We start by getting it's called a push to start token for the current device or for the device that we want to start a live activity on. And the way that we do that is through this async observer type thing where we can set up a task kind of when our app launches, and it will send through push tokens as they're created or made available. And then from there, you as the developer should send that to your server or wherever, and store it against kind of the user's profile. And this is all very familiar to you if you've sent push notifications before. And then from there, we need to construct our payload. And this is the payload that our server will send to Apple's push service. And then again, Apple's push service will send that down to the device. So the timestamp is the first thing to note here. It's just seconds since 1970. Pretty simple. There's a relevance score, and this is only important if you're going to be showing multiple live activities at the same time. So if there's a couple from the same app on the lock screen, it will show the one with the highest relevance score ahead of one with the lowest relevance score. So if you had two games of footy on and one was about to start and the other had already started, you probably have the one that's already started as higher priority and then switch them when it ends. So speaking of multiple live activities, there's a limit of 5 per app. That's just a system enforced limit. And if you try and start any beyond that, it'll fail. Now, importantly, we also want to set the event type to start here in our payload. before moving on to our content state. So this actually matches up quite closely with the content state that we created in the app before, and it contains all of those changing properties. And it should just match that model that the app is expecting. There's also the attributes. So because this is the start event, the initial event for kicking off the live activity, we do need to set the attributes. But this is the only request where we'll need to send the attributes to the push service. Now, also importantly, to start a live activity specifically, you do need to set these alert parameters. It's a title and body. It's actually a very similar payload to if you were sending a push notification. I don't think this text is shown anywhere. It might be shown briefly on the Apple Watch, but definitely not on the iPhone. But it does need to exist in like the content payload to have the live activity actually start. And then finally, so that the system knows what live activity we're trying to start, we need to set the attributes type as well. And so with all of that done, there's a little bit of work there, but with all of that done, we send that request, it lands on our device, and the live activity is started just like before, and it's on the lock screen of our device. So it's pretty cool. Now, updating live activities from a server, it's worth noting that you can mix and match like the way that you start or update a live activity. So you can start it from a server and you can update it in the app, or vice versa. You can start it in the app and update it in the server. It doesn't really matter. Similarly, you can mix and match individual updates if you like. But yeah, I'm just kind of going through them one by one because it's easier from this perspective. All right, so we actually need a different token to the one we got before to start the live activity if we want to update it. And the way that we get that is once our live activity has started, we need to observe this push token updates async sequence. And yeah, regardless of how the live activity is started, this is something we need to do. If our live activity started remotely, you are given some background time to wait for this token and then to process it and send it to your server. And it is emphasis on it's generated asynchronously. So it's not just there the moment a live activity is started. It's not a long delay, but it is definitely coming from a server somewhere. It's not generated on device or anything. So yeah, just like the start token, we send that to our server, associate it with the user or the current live activity. And then we start constructing payloads to send updates. And this is actually a lot simpler than our payload for starting a live activity. Of course, we need to set the event type to something other than start. We need to set it to update. And then all we need to do differently here is generate our updated content state. And then once that lands on our device, again, the system is responsible for regenerating all of those views, and it'll show it on the lock screen, or when you unlock, it'll show it in the dynamic island. It's pretty cool. And something to note is that I think the idea here is Apple don't want you sending live activity updates at the same time you're sending push notifications for what could essentially be the same thing. And so they've given a way to make a live activity behave like a notification. And this should be used sparingly, of course, only when important information comes through. But when you update a live activity, if you also attach this alert, like part of the payload with a title and a body, again, what will happen is, assuming the phone's unlocked in this case, the dynamic island will expand and you can see kind of more content. And your phone will like vibrate and play a sound and all that. So it is very much like receiving a notification. And it's pretty cool. But yeah, obviously use that sparingly because you don't want to be doing that too often. Just back to the alert with the title and body. I say that the title and body is never actually shown, as far as I know on iOS that's true, but on watchOS, at least it used to be the case that when an update came through for like a second or two, you'd see at least the title and maybe some of the body like overlaid on the live activity, but that doesn't seem to be happening in modern watchOS versions. I haven't looked too deeply into why, or if that's just my device or something going on, but yeah, it did used to be the case. I wouldn't put like total gibberish there, assume that it can be seen. But for the most part, the user's not gonna notice that or care, and the important information should be contained in the live activity anyway. Okay, ending a live activity from server, very similar to updating it, of course, with only a couple of key differences. We set the event type to end, and we set our final content state. Again, this needs to be final because once we've sent the end event, we can't update it. So we want to make sure that the game is actually ended, or whatever the end event is that we're waiting for. We can also optionally set the dismissal date, a bit like when we're doing it in Swift before. You can set a date in the future, or if you set a date in the past, it'll dismiss immediately. It's pretty straightforward. And there we go. Live activities ended. It's on the lock screen, hangs around for 4 hours. Interestingly, in this state, so when it's ended but not dismissed, it disappears from the dynamic island. So, and the live activity is only shown on the lock screen and in Notification Center. So depending on kind of the user experience you want, you might not want to end the live activity straight away. Maybe you want the score to hang around for 15, 20 minutes after a game or whatever. But obviously not all cases need that. So it's just worth keeping in mind. Okay, so that's it from on the technical side, really. But I did want to mention one quick thing about broadcast notifications, because these are really interesting, or at least I find them really interesting. So if you've worked with push notifications before, you'll know that there's kind of two types of push notifications you might send. One is extremely user specific. So if I like your photo on Instagram, you're getting a notification that, sorry Neil, I'm not liking your photo though. Just so yeah. Yeah, no. You're getting a very specific, notification. You're getting exactly like your photo. No one else is getting that exact notification at that moment in time. But then there's the other kind of notification type you might send, which is essentially the same notification being broadcast to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people all at the same time. And this is obviously, like, it's a lot of work to do this, but the way that it has worked, at least until now, is that you need to capture those device tokens for all of those devices. Let's say it's 100,000, all of those 100,000 device tokens, and then fire off essentially 100,000 requests at Apple's push service. And there are tools that wrap this and make sure that you can send, hundreds of thousands in very short windows of time, but it's still kind of wasteful. Your server or your service is sending all of these requests in a very short period of time. And this was true of the live activity update system as well, where you'd need to get all of those update tokens from all of the devices that might be subscribed to the exact same footy match. But that's no longer true in iOS 18. Apple introduced the concept of broadcast push notifications, and these are really interesting. Now, they're called broadcast push notifications, but they're only available for live activities at the moment. But the way that it works, and it's pretty cool, is that essentially as a user, you opt into receiving updates from a particular channel. So you as the developer might create a channel for each of the games you want to broadcast information about. And then when a user joins channel 1, 2, 3 and you want to update it, your service sends one update to Apple's push service. It's much less traffic, much less load on everyone's servers. And then Apple's service is responsible for then making sure those 100,000 devices get the update. And yeah, like I said, it's only available for live activities at the moment, but interestingly, it's called push notifications. So I'd just kind of keep an eye on this one. I'd expect it to be a thing that comes maybe in iOS 19, possibly Apple's testing the waters. And of course, realistically, if you were building this like footy scores app now, you would use this method, at least if you were targeting iOS 18 plus, because it does seem like at least it's the way to go for something like this. But that's all. There's no technical details on that, just because I haven't worked with it yet. And yeah, I've only worked with this other system, which seems to be working quite well for live activities. Okay, as promised, some very helpful resources if you're either interested in live activities or actually going to build some. The first is this blog post from Uber, and it's an engineering write-up about how they went through the design process and also some of the technical challenges that they overcame. And really, this is probably the main thing on this list, that if you're just an iOS developer who's interested in this stuff, give this a read, whether or not you're going to build live activities, because it's just a good blog post. There's also this blog post from iOS developer Christian Seelig talking a lot about the server side of live activities. So if that part interests you, this blog post kind of has it all in one place. It's really good. There's also this talk from WWDC 2023 titled Design Dynamic Live Activities. And if you're going to try and design a live activity, I'd suggest watching this first, because it talks a lot about the subtleties of designing for such a constrained space. And also, it's just a really aesthetically pleasing video, because there's heaps of good live activity design and animation that's shown in that video. And it's not too long from memory either. And then a couple of quick tips. Surprising, but Apple's documentation for live activity is actually really good. Like, I'm not joking. Pretty much everything you need to find, it's like probably close to 90% of what you need to know about live activities is documented on Apple's website or in the WWDC videos. There'll only be a few little things that you find yourself going to the web for, which is pretty cool.
Zach, we're in the room, man.
I think good job.
I couldn't let it go.
And then if you're testing your server implementation, this is true for live activities, but also if you're just like building a push notification system, you might have heard of this push notification console. And this is an Apple website that you can log into and kind of send payloads to a specific, like push payloads or live activity payloads to a specific device. And it gives you all kinds of feedback about whether the payload is valid, whether it was delivered. And this has been a really good debug tool because, you know, sometimes when you've got so many things involved, you don't know if the problem is from your server to Apple service or from the service to the device. Like this at least rules that out or gives you some feedback about whether your communication with Apple service is incorrect or you're sending the wrong payload or whatever. Yeah, that's all I have this time. So thanks for listening. I can answer questions if you have them. Yeah. Live activities, they're actually pretty cool. And they're fun to build. Like it's just one of those iOS features that you work on.
Question.
Yeah.
Why was the Dragons always beating the Bulldogs in those pictures? I'm a little bit confused. I feel like there's a little bit of bias going on here or something. I don't follow sports ball at all. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, I really sweat the details on the slides, and I wanted it to be as accurate as possible. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Have you found live activities respond to things like you've suddenly lost your internet connection?
Yeah, not great. So in the case of like an app like this, if you're sending frequent enough updates, it's kind of recovered. But whether it kind of seems to lose updates, or there seems to be some cases where you send an end event while the device is offline and then it doesn't get delivered. And like push notifications, there are ways to say, I want this to be kind of held on Apple's servers for 60 minutes to try and get to the device. And so I think all that should be possible, but I just haven't gone too deep into guaranteeing it. But yeah, so anecdotally, it does seem like updates are missed, but I also think as a developer, there's more things they could be doing. So I'm not willing to say that that's Apple's fault yet. I think it might be mine.
So the yellow soccer score is not going to be great.
No, just okay. I have to rant about this. For doing this stuff, I've been testing apps and downloading them and whatever. And one of them was there's an app I won't name for soccer scores, and I downloaded it and I'm like, okay, I'll subscribe to this upcoming Sydney FC match. I don't know anything about. I'm not a soccer person, despite being a sport person generally. And yeah, sure enough, it was like I got the halftime alert and it was like 0-0. I'm like, well, that was great. What am I testing here? It's boring anyway. But if you follow a real sport, you'll get updates regularly.
Cricket would be even slower, right?
But the score is always ticking over in cricket, though.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it is.
No.
Yeah, it is. It is.
How many seagulls on it?
Yeah, did you drink? Can I make a goal sound?
Yeah.
Is that what you're... Oh, yeah, can you change your
No,
mind?
actually, I think the notifications, yes, they can.
Oh,
Yes, so it does behave more or less like a real notification, just without the interface. Yeah. So you can set a sound and all of that metadata you can set.
Do you know if you can use live activities from, I forget what the feature's called, app clips? That's the thing where it's like, yeah, good.
As in, if an app can use a live activity?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a really good question, though. Yeah, I don't know. I have to look that up. Yeah. Yeah, like I guess if you order at a restaurant and then you're waiting on your meal, like, I mean, do you need the status? Maybe not, but it could be cool.
I can imagine like in a parking.
Yeah.
app,
Yeah, that's
it'd
true.
Probably be the kind of thing where
Yeah.
thing is like, hey, you have X amount of.
Yeah.
Or like a flag hire type thing.
Yeah.
You go on,
Yeah.
I
I guess there's no
a bunch
tech.
of interactive experiences type things too.
I don't think there'd be. Oh, actually, I guess maybe an app clip can't have. Because you need the widget target, right? Like you need some binary sitting on the device that's processing these updates or can render the UI. I don't know if you could add that target to an app clip, which is already an extension. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
Something to explore. Like,
Yeah. It's a good question though. Yeah. Yes, Christian. Oh, Tom.
I was curious, is there a way for the live activities to update themselves? Like a lot of these things have a timer. Like, is there a way to get it to have some kind of logic within the Swift UI view that is updating itself, and you don't have to send an update every second, I hope?
No. So the short answer to that is no. But depending on what the content is, like if it's a timer, there's certain. Sorry, I'll go back a step. Yeah, so I'm gonna say there's certain UI elements that you essentially give it one update and it's allowed to refresh itself regularly. So this is the same with widgets where you can set like a date or a timer or something like that where it's you're essentially just giving it one static date. So you might like say countdown to this date, and the system kind of is smart enough about only updating that tiny little UI component. And that works exactly the same in a live activity. So if you did have like the timer app, it would it's essentially initializing like a text or a date object or whatever with some date in the future, and then it's up to the system to animate. And you can animate those updates, which is cool, but you're not like getting the full like render process every second or whatever. But I have found, I mean, they cover probably 90% of cases really well, but I have found some of the formatting options just in widget work a little bit limiting, because sometimes you want to style a date or a time a certain way, and if it doesn't match what Apple's approved for the regular updates, you can't really do it. But yeah, for most cases, I'd say, yeah, you can do that. Yeah. Yeah, Craig?
I'm only gonna help because Pat did the work, and I want you.
Yes, you can offer live activities from clips.
You turn it the wrong way. The microphone's
there you
this
go.
way.
Yes, you can offer live activities from clips.
Awesome.
But they follow the normal rules, the 12-hour limit.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. I guess. While I'm up here, I'll wrap up CocoaHeads. So thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll be back next month on the 20th. So hope to see you again. Get home safe. Thanks.